Aristotle, one of the greatest minds in Western philosophy, shaped science, politics, and morality for over 2,000 years. But buried within his writings lies a deeply controversial perspective on women, one that few dare to mention today. Was Aristotle simply a product of his time, or was there a deeper philosophical reasoning behind his claims? In this video, we're going to uncover Aristotle's shocking views on women, examine the historical context, and reveal what these beliefs say about power, biology, and gender roles, then and now. Aristotle is often celebrated as the founding father of Western rational thought. He systematized logic, ethics, politics, and biology in ways that still shape our understanding of the world. But when we examine his views on women, we come face to face with a troubling contradiction. How could a man who championed reason, virtue, and the potential of the human soul hold such demeaning views about half of humanity? To Aristotle, reason was the highest faculty of the soul. The more one could reason, the more one could align with virtue and the divine. But in his worldview, women were fundamentally incapable of achieving this same rational perfection. He argued that women were governed more by emotions and passions than by logic. In his eyes, this made them naturally submissive, lacking in authority and unfit for leadership, whether in the home, the state, or in philosophy itself. Yet here's the paradox. Aristotle believed in cultivating virtue and excellence through education and practice. He believed that human beings could move toward their telos, their ultimate purpose or end. But he denied women access to this very process. If women were inferior in virtue, was it because they lacked the potential, or because society and philosophers like him denied them the tools? What makes this even more startling is that Aristotle was the student of Plato, who had a much more progressive view. In Plato's Republic, women were seen as capable of being philosopher kings, given the right education. But Aristotle rejected this. He grounded his view not in ideals, but in what he claimed were natural differences, observable through biology and social roles. He saw men as active, authoritative, and rational. Women, in contrast, were passive, obedient, and irrational. This rigid dichotomy influenced everything Aristotle touched, from his ethics to his politics. He argued that men were designed by nature to rule, while women were designed to be ruled. It wasn't just a social construct to him, it was embedded in the fabric of nature itself. This idea, more than any overt misogyny, reveals the true danger of Aristotle's thinking. It masked prejudice behind the authority of reason and nature. He went so far as to compare the relationship between man and woman to that of master and slave. In his Politics, he wrote that the male is by nature superior and the female inferior. One rules, and the other is ruled. To a modern reader, this is shocking, but for Aristotle, it was simply the natural order of things, something to be accepted, not challenged. Why did he think this way? Was it the cultural norms of ancient Athens, where women had no political rights and were expected to remain in the domestic sphere? Certainly, his society shaped his views, but Aristotle didn't merely reflect cultural norms. He justified and codified them with the weight of philosophy. And that's what makes his positions so enduring and dangerous. He turned sexism into a system of thought, cloaked in logic and observation. As we peel back the layers of Aristotle's philosophy, we must confront the uncomfortable truth. Even the most brilliant minds can be blinded by the assumptions of their age. And perhaps the real lesson here is not about women, but about how easily human bias can disguise itself as wisdom. Aristotle's views on biology were groundbreaking for his time, but they were also shockingly inaccurate and deeply biased, especially when it came to women. He didn't just argue that women were socially or politically inferior. He believed they were biologically defective. In fact, he famously wrote that the female is, as it were, a mutilated male. To Aristotle, the female body was the result of a failure in reproduction, a developmental error in the process that was meant to produce a male. This belief wasn't a fringe idea in his philosophy. It was central to his understanding of nature. He observed that men had more physical heat and strength, which he linked to greater rational capacity. Women, on the other hand, were colder, physically weaker, and therefore less capable of intellectual or moral excellence. In this crude biological framework, nature itself intended maleness as the standard of perfection. Femaleness was deviation, incompleteness, or a passive shadow of the male form. He also theorized that during conception, the male provided the form, the essential soul and structure, while the female contributed only the matter, the raw material. This reinforced the idea that women were passive vessels in reproduction, lacking the active principle of creation. This wasn't just biology to Aristotle, it was metaphysics. He built an entire worldview on the premise that activity is superior to passivity, reason to emotion, form to matter, and male to female. The problem is not just that Aristotle was wrong by today's standards. It's that he used flawed observations to justify a hierarchy of value between men and women. In doing so, he provided a scientific basis for discrimination that would influence scholars, theologians, and lawmakers for centuries. For example, medieval thinkers in the Christian and Islamic worlds absorbed Aristotle's biology and used it to argue that women were inherently inferior by design. Even in his zoological writings, Aristotle noted what he believed were differences in intelligence and courage between male and female animals, and he extended these assumptions to humans. He observed that female animals were more timid, less aggressive, and more nurturing. Rather than seeing these as evolutionary strategies or roles, he ranked them as signs of inferiority. This gave his biological sexism a universal scope. From insects to humans, nature had supposedly written a clear message. Male superiority was natural law. Modern science, of course, has dismantled these ideas. We now know that Aristotle's observations were limited by primitive tools, cultural bias, and a misunderstanding of reproduction. But the legacy of his thinking persisted for centuries. His ideas were repeated and reinforced by major figures in both religious and secular institutions. The damage wasn't just philosophical, it was institutional, educational, and deeply personal for millions of women over history. What's most unsettling is how confidently Aristotle presented his theories as truth. He wasn't trying to be malicious. He believed he was uncovering the natural order. And that's the danger. When bias wears the mask of science or reason, it becomes much harder to challenge, and far more powerful. Today, we look back and see the absurdity of calling women misbegotten men. But we must also recognize that similar distortions of science and logic still occur in modern debates about gender, race, intelligence, and value. Aristotle's shocking view of women is not just a relic of the past, it's a warning for the present. Even the brightest minds can be blinded by their assumptions. And if we're not careful, we can inherit those same blind spots, dressed up in new language. Aristotle's vision of society was meticulously structured. Every person, every class, every role had its designated place. In his ideal political system, everything and everyone was ordered according to what he believed was their natural function. And within that framework, women were relegated to the margins, not because of circumstance, but because of what he claimed was their innate nature. To Aristotle, a just society was one where everyone performed the role they were naturally suited for. And in his view, women's role was confined to the private domestic sphere, serving men, raising children, and maintaining the household. In politics, Aristotle clearly distinguishes between the oikos, the household, and the polis, the city-state. The household was the domain of women and slaves, while the city-state was the realm of free male citizens. Aristotle considered political engagement, philosophical discourse, and rational deliberation to be the highest expressions of human excellence. But these were activities reserved exclusively for men. Women, despite being human, were excluded from participating in the full development of their reason, because Aristotle believed their intellectual capacity was inherently limited. He argued that women lacked the rational deliberative faculty that defined citizenship. This wasn't just a social opinion, it was a philosophical judgment embedded in his very understanding of virtue and human purpose. He saw men as active, rational beings capable of self-governance, while women were passive, emotionally driven, and in need of governance. A woman's virtue, according to Aristotle, was not the same as a man's virtue. Where male virtue emphasized courage, justice, and reason, female virtue emphasized silence, obedience, and modesty. Not excellence, but compliance. This division was not simply practical, it was moralized. For a woman to try to enter the political or philosophical realm would be, in Aristotle's eyes, a violation of nature. She would be stepping outside of her natural function and thus creating disharmony in the social order. He believed that justice, both personal and political, was achieved when everyone performed their proper role. Therefore, to challenge these roles was, in his logic, unjust and even dangerous. What makes this perspective more disturbing is how it was enforced with philosophical confidence. Aristotle was not merely stating a personal preference, he was writing a blueprint for civilization. In his hierarchy, the male is to the female as the rational is to the irrational, as the soul is to the body, as the ruler is to the ruled. These comparisons created a rigid structure in which women were reduced to living tools for the advancement of men and the functioning of the state. Even in marriage, Aristotle viewed women as subordinate partners. He described the relationship between husband and wife as one of natural rule, where the man governs and the woman obeys. Her role was reproductive and supportive. She was essential, yes, but not equal. She was necessary for the continuation of society, but not for its leadership, its governance, or its intellectual legacy. This vision had long-term consequences. Aristotle's conception of a well-ordered society justified and reinforced patriarchy, not as a social arrangement, but as a metaphysical truth. And because Aristotle's works became central to educational, religious, and political institutions for centuries, these ideas were embedded into the very foundations of Western civilization. His exclusion of women from public life was not an isolated opinion. It became a philosophical cornerstone for generations that followed. When later thinkers, theologians, and lawmakers cited Aristotle, they inherited not just his logic and ethics, but also his hierarchy, one that placed women below men in every meaningful category of human excellence. His vision of justice left no room for gender equality. It was a justice built on exclusion, hierarchy, and submission. And the echoes of that vision are still felt today, in subtle and not so subtle ways, in the structures and assumptions that govern our world. Aristotle's influence did not die with the fall of ancient Greece. In fact, it expanded. His works were preserved, translated and revered by the Islamic Golden Age scholars, Christian theologians, and Renaissance philosophers who shaped modern Western thought. And with them came his views on women, wrapped in the authority of one of the greatest minds in history. During the Middle Ages, Aristotle's philosophy became the backbone of Christian scholasticism, especially through the writings of Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas merged Aristotelian metaphysics with Christian doctrine, creating a powerful intellectual tradition that guided the Church for centuries. He adopted Aristotle's view that women were biologically and intellectually inferior to men, stating that a woman is a defective male, a belief that had enormous implications for Christian theology, particularly in the teachings on sin, obedience, and the role of women in the family and church. In Islamic philosophy, thinkers such as Averroes, Ibn Rushd, engaged deeply with Aristotle's works. While some Islamic scholars questioned his more extreme claims about gender, many still accepted the basic idea that women were naturally suited for domestic roles, not public life. Across cultures and centuries, Aristotle's ideas were treated not as hypotheses, but as truths that reinforced existing power structures and justified the exclusion of women from education, politics, science, and religion. In the Enlightenment, as reason and science were celebrated, Aristotle's legacy remained. Ironically, the very thinkers who championed human rights and rationality often still held deeply sexist views, many inherited directly or indirectly from Aristotelian logic. Rousseau, for example, believed that women should be educated solely to please and serve men. Even Immanuel Kant, a giant of Enlightenment thought, echoed Aristotle's view that women lacked the rational and moral depth of men. And so, the ripple effect continued. Aristotle's hierarchical thinking seeped into the legal codes, social customs, and educational systems of Europe and beyond. Women were systematically denied access to formal education and political voice, with arguments drawn directly from Aristotelian reasoning. When women did begin to fight for equality, in the suffrage movements, in education, in science, they had to battle not only cultural norms, but centuries of philosophical doctrine that had declared them less than fully human in reason and virtue. The damage was not just structural, but psychological. For centuries, women were told that they were not meant to lead, not meant to learn, not meant to speak. And the force behind these messages was not always overt prejudice. It was often cloaked in the language of nature, logic, and philosophy. When a belief is rooted in what is natural, it becomes almost impossible to question. That is the lasting power of Aristotle's influence. Even in modern times, remnants of Aristotle's gender philosophy persist. The idea that women are too emotional for leadership, too nurturing for logic-based fields like science or politics, too passive for entrepreneurship, these stereotypes echo his ancient conclusions. They may be expressed differently now, but the roots can be traced back to a worldview that divided humanity into rulers and the ruled thinkers and feelers, men and women. Understanding the ripple effect of Aristotle's views is not just an exercise in history. It's a call to recognize how deeply entrenched ideas can shape societies, long after their original context has faded. His philosophy reminds us that ideas matter. They don't just reflect the world, they create it. And unless we critically examine the foundations of our beliefs, we risk perpetuating old hierarchies under new names. So the question we must ask today is not just whether Aristotle was wrong about women, but how many of his assumptions still quietly live on in our institutions, our cultures, and our own thinking. Only by confronting those inherited ideas can we begin to build a more just and equal world. So where does this leave us today? Should we cancel Aristotle for his views on women? Should we disregard his legacy entirely because of the deeply sexist ideas embedded in his work? Or is there another path, one that neither excuses his errors nor erases his contributions, but forces us to reflect more deeply on the complexity of human thought? This is where modern philosophy, feminism, and historical awareness come into play. The first and most important truth to confront is that even the most brilliant thinkers are shaped and often limited by the cultures they live in. Aristotle wasn't writing in a vacuum. He lived in a deeply patriarchal society where women were seen as property, denied education, and excluded from political life. His views, as repugnant as they may sound to modern ears, were not shocking in ancient Athens. In fact, they were considered normal. But that's precisely why we must be careful. The danger lies not just in what Aristotle said, but in how unquestioningly later generations accepted and institutionalized those views. The problem wasn't only Aristotle's mistake, it was the long chain of thinkers, theologians, and leaders who elevated his opinions to eternal truths without ever asking, Could he be wrong? Modern scholars, especially feminist philosophers, have done crucial work in re-evaluating Aristotle's legacy. They acknowledge his intellectual brilliance while also exposing the biases in his thinking. For example, philosopher Elizabeth Spellman has explored the idea that many classical thinkers, including Aristotle, constructed their theories of universal human nature by using men as the default and excluding women from that definition. In other words, what Aristotle called human excellence was actually male excellence, disguised as universal truth. We now understand that Aristotle's assumptions about biology were based on faulty observation and limited scientific tools. His belief that women were colder and biologically passive wasn't science, it was speculation. Today we know that women are not misbegotten men, that their brains are not inherently less rational, and that emotional intelligence and empathy are not inferior to reason. They are vital components of a healthy society. Neuroscience, psychology, and biology have shattered the simplistic dualisms Aristotle relied on. So the real value in revisiting Aristotle's views on women isn't to condemn him, but to learn from his failure. His mistakes offer us a mirror, showing how easily intelligence can be distorted by assumption, how logic can be twisted by bias, and how philosophy, if not self-critical, can become a tool of oppression rather than liberation. This is not just a lesson about gender, it's a lesson about human nature. Every generation believes it sees the world clearly. Every thinker believes they are speaking from a place of reason. But all of us are shaped by invisible cultural frameworks. Aristotle reminds us that brilliance does not guarantee fairness, and that even the most rational arguments can be laced with prejudice. That's why philosophy matters. It's not about memorizing the thoughts of dead men. It's about questioning them. It's about putting every idea, no matter how sacred, under the microscope of reason and morality. The goal is not to find perfect thinkers, but to cultivate better thinking. And that means asking hard questions, not just about Aristotle, but about the assumptions we still carry today. Think of how many modern debates still echo Aristotelian logic. When people argue that women are naturally better suited for caregiving and men for leadership, they are unknowingly repeating his claims. When leaders insist that a woman's emotionality makes her unfit for power, they're drawing from a centuries-old script. These ideas did not vanish, they evolved, became more subtle, more socially acceptable, but no less dangerous. And so, confronting Aristotle is not about rewriting history, it's about reclaiming it. We can't change the fact that his views on women helped justify centuries of exclusion, discrimination, and silence. But we can break the spell they've had over intellectual thought. We can teach his brilliance without ignoring his bias. We can admire his contributions to logic, ethics, and politics, while refusing to adopt his hierarchies as our own. We must also celebrate the thinkers who broke the mold, women who defied the roles Aristotle claimed were natural. From Hypatia in ancient Alexandria to Simone de Beauvoir in the 20th century, women have always thought, led, taught, and created. They were simply written out of the story, or never written in at all. Aristotle didn't just misunderstand women, he misunderstood humanity. He divided it too neatly: reason versus emotion, ruler versus ruled, male versus female. Today we know that humanity is more complex, more fluid, more interdependent than that. Emotion can be a guide to wisdom. Leadership can be grounded in empathy. Greatness can come from any gender, any race, any background. So what do we do with Aristotle's shocking truth? We expose it, we teach it, we examine it, not to destroy his legacy, but to purify it. Philosophy is not about perfection, it's about progress. And progress begins when we stop worshipping our heroes and start learning from their flaws. In the end, Aristotle's error doesn't make him less human. It makes him more human. A brilliant mind, chained by the blind spots of his time. And if we're not careful, we might find ourselves doing the same, judging others, limiting possibilities, and calling it natural. The true philosopher is not the one who has all the answers, but the one brave enough to keep asking the questions.